Stephen Phelps is a really interesting scientist down at UT Austin, and I actually know him through the Twitterverse. And he's a spectacular person. He studies animal behavior, and he knew about these mice. And somehow he got talking to Michael Long, who's a really spectacular scientist at NYU, who studies communication. He studies birdsong, laboratory mouse communication, and some human communication. But along the way, I guess these two were talking to each other, and Steve said, what about this other species of mouse? These singing mice appear to sing to each in a polite way, shall we say.
It's not news that mice make noise.
All sorts of animals make noises.
And vocalize.
And those vocalizations may even mean something. They may even be interpreted by other members of the species as something. So, for example, a rat or a mouse that makes an alarm call, that might be information, used as information by others that are around. Oh, I better get to a hiding place. So we're talking about it for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's not a dolphin or a whale, and one can actually get them in the laboratory and do some experiments. So they got a few bunch of pairs, and what they saw was that they would sing to each other. And how do you know they're singing to each other? They would wait for a certain amount of time, and when this one ended, this one would start. And when this one ended, this one would start. So they are being responsive.
And they actually, as I understand it, with the experiment, they had two mice who couldn't see each other.
When they're alone, they make songs. They don't do it that often, and they're relatively short. But when there's another mouse, they're exuberant. They start to sing a lot, and they do it, and they make a longer song. And they do it timed to the other one's finishing its song. So that's pretty cool, but that's still not why this is a big splash. The reason it's a big splash is because they looked at what the neural control is for this singing. So here's a couple of different examples for how we could do this. We can say, here's motor cortex, and I'm going to send a signal down to brainstem, to actually an area that I used to study a lot, an area called the periaqueductal gray.
Ah, yes.
It's involved in vocalization. And I can just tell it to sing, and then the periaqueductal gray will put out a song. That's one option. And the other option is that the motor cortex is going to give specific instructions to the periaqueductal gray as to what to sing. So to try and figure which of those was going on, they started to muck around with the motor cortex of these singing mice. So the first thing they did was to stimulate in this area. They just put a little electrode and they stimulate. And they just take a little bit of current. What stimulation does is to pause the song. So how does it pause it? That's the really interesting thing. That's the really interesting analysis they did. There are two possibilities.
One, that it would be just like you put it on pause and it would just pick up, the song would pick up where you stopped. The other was that it would be as if you turned off the sound and the song kept playing, and they would pick up later on in the song.
Or some variation on those two things.
Right. Oh, yes, yes.
And so what they found was that it put it on pause, and then it picked up where it had left off. It suggests that the motor cortex is timing the song, and that is not a production of the PAG, of the periaqueductal gray, which is still going along. But unless it gets this input from the motor cortex, it doesn't continue to make the song.
Right.
So it is a very hierarchical, it's a very high-level control system where the motor cortex doesn't say make a syllable, the mouse does not make a syllable.
Which is to say that the breathing and vocal, all those kind of mechanisms that go into creating a song are tied. It's not an automatic tape.
The motor cortex is being micromanager here. It's saying, I'm going to do each one of these syllables.
Right.
And if you call me, okay, I didn't do them, so I gotta pick up where I left off.
And one of the things I read in the paper is that I don't really give a lot of thought to how complex a conversation really is. That you have to pay attention in context to what is being said in context, then answer in context with the proper timing, then shut up, listen for the other. It's a much, who thinks about it? I don't.
One of the really interesting things about these songs is that they're made of syllables, okay? Little short bits that are continuous, and then there's a short little break, and then there's another one. And each of the syllables, as the song progresses, the syllables get longer and longer in length, in duration. What that tells us is that the motor cortex is directing the downstream areas, mostly we think about the PAG, to make syllables of a certain length. And it doesn't just trust, it doesn't say, okay, make a song, it says make a syllable. And if I, motor cortex, don't tell you to make a syllable, don't make a syllable. You don't make a syllable, and you're going to wait for me. I thought that was a really cool part of the project. One
of the things that I also thought it was mentioned in the papers was that it reminds you that, because there's one particular kind of mouse that tends to get studied a lot. The common mouse is that's kind of the official mouse for scientific research. And there are this was a species of mouse that folks like you don't routinely study.
And we're restricting ourselves intellectually by restricting ourselves to a very low number of species that we study. And so studying these animals, I think, expands intellectual horizons. I don't think anyone was thinking that mice could have this kind of reciprocal conversation. Even if we don't know exactly what they're saying, and even if what they're saying doesn't have grammar, which I would suspect it doesn't, it's just an utterance, but it's still communication. And it's still a two-way street, and they have to listen to respond at the right time. So that actually leads to the next thing that they did, which was to cool down the motor cortex. And in that situation, when they cool down the motor cortex, what happens is it takes longer for them to make these syllables. So now motor cortex is telling the periaqueductal gray, make a 50 millisecond syllable, but it's saying it, make a 50 millisecond syllable. So it's saying it so slowly that it's not a 50 millisecond syllable, it's longer. And so as you go across, these syllables are getting longer and the whole song gets longer, but it progresses more slowly.
Right, but it's still the same song.
It's still the same song, it's just slowed down. And if you cool it by 3 degrees, it slows down this much, and if you cool it by 6 degrees, it slows down even more so. That's all very consistent with this idea that the motor cortex is a micromanager. And the final thing that they did was, instead of cooling, they used a pharmacological approach to inactivate the motor cortex. They injected something called mucimol, which is a drug that acts as though it's GABA. And as you may remember, GABA is a neurotransmitter. It's also an amino acid, but it's an amino acid neurotransmitter that is the most common inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain. And so it's going to just slow everything down. So there were a few really interesting things. They still sang spontaneously. But when they put the mucimol into the motor cortex, the responsiveness was off. So if they put saline, which does nothing, it's pharmacologically inert, this mouse sings, and then this mouse sings right at the offset of this one. But if they put in the mucimol and they inhibit that motor cortex, this mouse sings, and sometimes somewhere around here the other mouse would sing, but often not. So what it's doing is it's disrupting this polite responsiveness, which is really a phenomenal thing. You think of motor cortex as much less highfalutin than politeness. You know, you think of politeness and responsiveness as being very prefrontal cortex, but in this situation, it looks as though the motor cortex is intimately involved in this turn taking that the mice do. What's exciting about that is that it's not as though they can't sing, because they sing spontaneously. What they can't do is respond politely. They found the polite circuit, okay?
Right, yes, the politeness. Well, look, that counts. But so, and it's certainly it's easy to imagine the utility of that in an evolutionary sense, assuming because they use these vocalizations for mating, right, and for just general communication within the
Territory for sure. What's really neat about this is that it's a new finding. It's a new species that hasn't been on the neurobiology radar. We have our squids, we have our octopuses, we have our zebrafish, we have sea slugs for sure. We have all sorts of model organisms, and this is a new one. And I think that's really exciting. It's just such a beautifully creative study.
Now, well, that was another thing that it was described as the beautiful and elegant experiment. What the heck does it mean for an experiment to be beautiful and elegant?
I like the novelty of it. Here we have this new animal that we hadn't thought about, and it takes somebody such as Steve Phelps to know about this animal. I actually see the experiments as pretty simple, and I like the elegance of simple. There's technology there, but it's pretty simple technology. These are techniques that have been around for a long time.
It's nice that you could describe this to virtually anyone and we can understand it. You play the recording of the mouse, and given various manipulations at various intervals, the other mouse will answer. And then you can infer from that what you like. But it's nice, as you say, it is nice and simple, and you could write it on a single sheet of paper if you want to. But of course they didn't. It was a much longer series of papers. But you could explain it to a layperson with relative ease, and that's kind of cool.
And it's a very highfalutin function.
Yes.
To have communication is a big deal, even if that communication doesn't have syntax or grammar and it can't tell you about mathematics or art, but it still can communicate. And it communicates obviously well enough for these animals to survive in their environment. So it's good enough for evolution. So that's pretty good.